Hey folks, Matt Easton here, scholagladiatoria. So here I have another historical account from the Indian Mutiny. Those who watch my channel regularly will know this is a favourite of mine, but it has to be said the Indian Mutiny of 1857 to 58-59 has a lot of very interesting first-hand accounts of combat involving both firearms and swords and knives and other weapons. So it provides very fertile ground for harvesting nice accounts of 19th century combat. And here is one recited by Lieutenant de Kantzow of the 9th Bengal Native Infantry. Now what I'm going to attempt to do as I go through this account is I'm going to attempt to show examples, actual original examples that I own of every weapon that is mentioned in this account. So let's see how we go. So he starts off. The following is the lieutenant's own account of his exploit. I was returning from reconnoitring when information was brought to me that 5 troopers of the 7th Light Cavalry, Bengal Light Cavalry it is, were coming along the road. So they are rebels essentially, they're mutinous cavalry troopers. An immediate pursuit was of course ordered by me, and 39 troopers tore away at full speed after me. Right, so what would they have had? Well, as they were regular cavalry, they almost certainly would have been carrying either this 1853 pattern cavalry trooper's sword, or perhaps the predecessors to this, the 1821. However, there is a possibility, because they had become mutinous, there is a possibility that many of them might have switched to their own native swords, which would have been tulwars like this. So we probably would have seen a mixture of British regulation cavalry swords and the native Indian tulwar as well. As for Lieutenant de Kantzow himself, he was of the Bengal Native Infantry, so he would have had an infantry officer's sword much like this one, that is brass hilted with a slightly shorter and lighter blade than the cavalry troopers' swords. However, it is possible, as was sometimes the case with Indian serving officers, that he would have switched to a non-regulation sword. So it's possible that he may have had something which may have had, instead of a brass hilt, it might have had a steel hilt. It may, instead of a fullered blade, have had a flat blade or some other form of blade. Or indeed, it may have been a more curved sword. It's even possible, because we know that this was the case, some British officers did carry native Indian swords as well, of various types, straight and curved. John Nicholson being one of the most famous British users of an Indian sword. So there we go. So there's various swords that he actually could have had for himself. So let's carry on with the account. And my 39 troopers tore away at full speed after me, so he charged towards them with his own 39 cavalry troopers, who would have had almost certainly the 1853 pattern cavalry trooper sword, or perhaps the earlier 1821. I was just coming up to them and had already let drive among the murderous villains, when lo, I came upon 200 of their comrades, all armed with swords and some with carbines. So what would they have had? Well, almost certainly their comrades would have had, as mentioned, mostly probably would have had tulwars. In terms of the carbines, it would have been exactly like this. It's the carbine version of the Enfield, or the earlier 1842 version. So it is a short sidearm, rather a short firearm that's for use by cavalry, and is shorter because it can hang essentially here quite conveniently. It hangs from a belt that goes across the side, and when you, sometimes it was kept in a sort of holster type thing, but usually it was hung from the side on a belt, and when needed it could be brought to bear, fire, and then you could draw your sword and use that. You could also dismount, of course, and act as mounted infantry, so you could dismount and carry on fighting on foot with your gun and your sword, essentially. A smart fire was kept up at a distance of not more than 25 yards. What could 39 do against 200 regular troopers, well horsed and armed, particularly when walked into by the bullets of 100 of the infantry? So infantry have apparently turned up now as well, and the infantry would have been armed with this. Okay, I don't have a lot of space to show this in this room, unfortunately. This is the Enfield 1853 musket with bayonet attached. There we go. Bring the bayonet to bear. In fact, many of the Indian rebels had apparently rejected the use of the Enfield musket due to the greased cartridges. So they would have been using the earlier 1842 smoothbore musket, and some might have been using Brunswick rifles as well. So they're now faced with a lot of the enemy, and there's only 39 of them. I ordered a retreat, sensible, but my cavalry could not get away from the troopers mounted upon good stud-bred horses. So we were soon overtaken, and then commenced the shindy, like shindig, in earnest. Obviously this is Victorian language, so some of it is requires a little bit of explanation. 12 troopers surrounded me. The first, a Mohammedan, in other words, is Islamic priest, I shot through the breast just as he was cutting me down. So we know from what he subsequently says that he only had a single shot pistol like this, and what the Mohammedan priest was almost certainly using was a tulwar or some other form of native sword. So he shot the priest in the chest, hence saving himself. I shot through the breast just as he was cutting me down. This was my only pistol, so I was helpless as regards weapons save my sword. So the infantry officer's sword, or possibly he'd switched to a cavalry sword, we don't know. This guarded off a swinging cut given to me by number 2, the second attacker, as also by number 6, but the fun could not last. I bitterly mourned not having a couple of revolvers, for I could have shot every man. So it's important to note that, at least in British circles in 1857, revolvers were still relatively new, and so a lot of people in the 1850s had switched from single shot pistols to, or some case double barrel pistols, to early transitional revolvers. But by 1857 the most popular 2 revolvers were the Colt Navy and either the Adams or the Beaumont-Adams. The Beaumont-Adams is double action and has the spur on the hammer there. The earlier Adams doesn't. And so these were very, very popular, but they were still relatively hard to come by and relatively expensive, and not many officers yet had them in British service. And for right or wrong, and whether it was the case or not, there was a belief that if you had some revolvers, it was almost like having a magic wand and you could shoot, you know, kill a load of the enemy and survive. In actual fact, there are lots of accounts that show that wasn't always the case. It is interesting in this account that the blow that was swung at him, he parried with his sword. Had he been able to shoot the person if he'd had a revolver, not necessarily the case that he would have defended himself from that sword cut. Just because you shoot someone doesn't mean that they stop swinging their sword at you. Right, so on to the next part. I bitterly mourned not having a couple of revolvers, for I could have then shot every man. My sword was cut down, in other words beaten down, and I got a slash on the head that blinded me, presumably from blood. Another on the arm that glanced and only took a slice off. Oh, that's fine, just a slice off the arm. The third caught me on the side, but also glanced and hit me sideways. I know not how I escaped, God only knows, as 12 against 1 were fearful odds, especially as I was mounted on a pony bareback. Bear in mind he's a native infantry officer, so he's presumably not properly mounted as if he would have been if he was a cavalry officer. Escape, however, I did. And after many warm escapes, too numerous to mention, I got back here. 14 of my brave fellows were killed, 4 wounded, 6 missing. Total 24 out of 39. Good odds, was it not? So he goes on to say in a letter that he was praised by the Major General, Lieutenant Governor of Bengal, and his doings brought to the notice of the Governor General. So he did good service, and in fact he did various other things in the mutiny of note. But there's several interesting things in there. We've got many different weapons. We've got, as shown, we've got tulwars, Indian tulwars, or other forms of Indian sword, as well as British regulation cavalry swords being used. Probably we've got an infantry officer's sword being used of some kind, unless you'd switch to a non-regulation sword. We have carbines, that is short muskets, essentially shortened muskets. We've got either rifles or full-length muskets, would have had, almost certainly had bayonets fitted. And it's notable that Indian troops like to carry swords as well as having bayonets. And then we've got the ubiquitous single-shot pistol, and the certainly in the Indian Mutiny, the common call for revolvers, and as I've mentioned before, letters home begging relatives to please buy me one of Colt's or Adams' revolvers and send them out to India as soon as possible. One thing that's worth mentioning finally before I wrap this up is that indeed single-shot pistols, as you will notice from here, so the Colt is a 36 caliber, this is about a .72 caliber. So whilst you might think 6 shots versus 1, it doesn't always equate like that. There are many records, particularly of the 36 caliber, not having a desired effect on the opponent, whereas a .72 ball, even if it doesn't hit you in the chest or the head, if it hits you in the leg or the arm, it's going to do a huge amount of damage, because it's a large, really big lump of lead flying at high speed towards you. So single shot and double shot pistols weren't always so much worse than revolvers. And also the other thing to mention about revolvers, as we've seen before, is they often misfired. Percussion caps sometimes wouldn't go off, particularly with the Colt 1851. It had a common problem of the percussion caps getting stuck in the mechanism when it was cocked, which prevents the cylinder from rotating and prevents the hammer from falling. So there are all sorts of technical difficulties with early revolvers, and some officers, it should be said, in India actually elected to have large bore man-stopper pistols like this, or double-barreled versions of this known as howdah pistols, which were primarily originally, I think, designed to use for hunting tigers. They did elect to use those instead of revolvers. Some people famously, even Hodson of Hodson's Horse, didn't actually put a lot of faith in their revolvers. And once again we find another example of how the sword saved this person's life. He defended himself by parrying, by guarding from cuts that were thrown at him. Had he had a revolver, he might have kept firing and might have got cut down in the process. So swords, still good in the middle of the 19th century. I hope that historical account is another interesting one. Cheers folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.